Hello, this is a continuation of my summary of Alistair Parker's short history of the Second World War. This one dealing with Anglo-American strategies for victory, part 2, the 42-43 period. So we have two videos in this particular chapter. The chapter's not very long. So in part 1, we talked about American and British strategic ideas up until Pearl Harbor, essentially, and the Arcadia conference, which followed that in December 41 and January 1942. So we're now going to continue from there. Meanwhile, things were not going well for the Allies in their war, and during the early part of 1942, the Japanese advance in Southeast Asia and the Pacific seemed unstoppable, as did the Germans in the Soviet Union, whilst the British in Egypt were unable to push back the Italians and Germans. For the British, a cross-channel invasion of mainland Europe in 1942 or even 1943 was seen as being too hazardous. Unless the Soviet Red Army was able to inflict a major defeat on the Germans would simply be able to transport more troops to the west than the British and Americans could bring across the Channel, and the invasion would therefore fail. During 1942, with the added pressure of Soviet demands for the Western Allies to open a second front, disagreements between the British and the Americans continued. The British finally openly rejecting the American idea of an invasion of Europe in July 1942. In response, Marshall, essentially the head of the American army, and the US military threatened to divert their attention to their war with Japan. But Roosevelt now intervened decisively. The war with Germany had to have priority. The British plan for an invasion of Northwest Africa was accepted, and the Allies would not attack Europe directly until conditions were more favorable. Roosevelt also came to back the British plan for further attacks in the Mediterranean after North Africa had been secured, with the invasion of Sicily, then followed by Italy, even though Marshall regarded such efforts as diversions from what should be the Anglo-American primary objectives. British ideas for an attack on the Balkans, however, came to nothing. Political factors were also relevant here. The Soviets might make peace and leave the Western Allies to fight it out with the Germans. There was widespread British and American public sympathy for the Soviet resistance to German aggression. The popular American desire to strike back against Japan was very powerful. And then there was the need for some success by the British after their string of defeats to maintain morale and also political support for Churchill. In January 1943, there was another Anglo-American colloquy near Casablanca, within reach of General Eisenhower in command of the Allied forces now established in Northwest Africa. The American military chiefs felt that they were outsmarted by their British counterparts in these meetings, but divisions between the American chiefs and Roosevelt not forcing them to adopt a united front also played into the hands of the united and well-prepared British. Sicily would be next in terms of conquest, and Italy should be knocked out of the war. Turkey required too much assistance to join the Allies, even though if Turkey had joined, it would have greatly strengthened the Allied position in the Balkans and communications with the Soviets. In any case, German submarine power made it impossible, it was thought, to secure a beachhead for an invasion of France in 1943 to succeed. The transshipment of American forces was also behind schedule, and estimates for the amount of shipping needed to continue to supply Britain with essential supplies, as well as to build up American troop presence, were unrealistic. Roosevelt again held firm in supporting the British. Another Anglo-American conference was held in Washington in May 1943, followed by one in Quebec in August, this time with much greater agreement, including acceptance of an invasion of France, scheduled for spring 1944. The two militaries began to work together with increasing mutual confidence and frankness. Meanwhile, Sicily had been taken in July-August 1943, and Mussolini overthrown in July. In September, the Western Allies invaded Italy, and on the 8th of September, the Italian government surrendered. Now let's turn to policies regarding China and Japan. Marshall and Roosevelt had initially believed that Chiang Kai-shek could play a major role in the defeat of Japan, analogous to the Soviets against Germany. The Americans therefore should train and equip the Chinese to this end. For Roosevelt, Kuomintang China was a great power and one of the Big Four. By contrast, Churchill had a low opinion of Chiang and the Kuomintang regime. As Chiang's forces had been supplied from Burma via the Burma Road, and only continued to be supplied by air from Assam across the Himalayas after the Japanese had closed that road, the Americans pressured the British to help either take back the whole, or at least the northern part of Burma, in order that Chiang could again receive supplies by road. They also wanted the British to organize an amphibious assault on the Andaman Islands so as to isolate Rangoon, an idea the British resisted. Gradually, American enthusiasm for Chiang Kai-shek waned, and it became obvious that Kuomintang couldn't even defend their existing airfields, let alone taking territory back from the Japanese for the construction of new Allied air bases. The Japanese began to make major new advances in China in April 1944, seizing possible sites for American bases as well as the southern ports. The American idea of invading Japan from China was evidently impossible. As an invasion of Japan from China was now seen as impossible, the Americans had to consider alternatives. The northern route via the Aleutian Islands was unpromising because of the climate, so this left two possible southern routes. One along the coast of New Guinea and then through the Philippines and the seizure of Luzon, and the other along the Central Pacific Islands, the Marshalls, the Carolines, and the Marianas. Marshall wanted to continue, meanwhile, American efforts in Europe, although he did use the threat of supporting these alternatives to frighten the British. So this map gives you some idea of the strategic choices facing the Western Allies. So to actually end the war with Japan, Japan itself, the home islands, would need to be defeated. And if it was obviously no longer possible to think about invading through China, and the northern route from the Aleutians off Alaska was just not practical, then that left two possibilities, either through the large islands of Southeast Asia or the small islands of the Pacific. The proponent of the large island choice was General Douglas Macarthur, the most melodramatically glamorous of the American generals. So his idea was to get the Americans to attack along the coast of, and the Australians, I should say, along the coast of New Guinea, and then through the Philippines and seize Luzon. His opponent was Admiral Ernest King of the US Navy, who advocated an attack along the Central Pacific Islands, relying on amphibious operations supported by naval guns and carrier-borne aircraft. In the event, there were compromises, and all of these plans proceeded. So the Americans fought two wars simultaneously, one each in the Pacific and in Europe. And in the Pacific, both Macarthur's and the Navy's plans went into operation. They combined briefly in the attack on Leyte in October 1944, before separating to secure bases for the eventual invasion of Japan, Macarthur to Luzon and the Pacific Fleet to Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Early in 1944, the Americans had about 1.8 million men in each theater, that's Europe and the Pacific, though there were more sailors and Marines in the Pacific and more Army and Air Force personnel in Europe. The strategic priorities were never fully worked out by the Americans, with competing elements seizing opportunities as they could. The results were a combination of both foresight and planning and of flexibility. Parker concludes, it is difficult convincingly to argue that the Allies could more rapidly have forced German and Japanese surrender. Finally, Parker draws attention to the importance of landing craft in Anglo-American strategy as a dominant element. They were essential for putting ground forces ashore on enemy-held coastlines. They were built in various sizes and for different purposes. This is a very famous photo of American troops landing during the Normandy invasion in 1944 in a landing craft vehicle personnel, the LCVP. Other landing craft were much larger and used to transport tanks, for example. This is an early trial of one of the larger ones in 1942. In Europe, the peak moment for landing craft was June 1944, when at least 4,618 had been deployed, including 1,609 larger craft for landing tanks or trucks as well as troops. In the Pacific, meanwhile, there were 3,985, mostly of the smaller type, that only landed men. On the first day of the Normandy landings, 150,000 Allied troops were landed in France. Shortly after that, about 125,000 men were ferried 1,000 miles from the Marshalls to invade the Marianas. In both theaters, decisive battles followed. Here, by the way, is an American amphibious tractor, water buffalo, so-called, loaded with Marines in the invasion of the Marianas. So that concludes the chapter. Many thanks for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement. Without them, I wouldn't be able to make these videos. If you want to support my channel, you're very welcome to do so. Please do like, comment, and share on the videos themselves. It really does help. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. I'll give Patreon and, for the moment, PayPal links below if you want to provide practical assistance. Next week, we'll move on to a new chapter and talk about economies at war. Have a good day.